Hello, students of Suffragettes. It's Mr. C here. I'm sitting next to Emily Davison, and today we're going to go on a little tour around London to see sites associated with her and her struggle to achieve votes for women. I've made my way up to Caxton Street around the back of St James's Park Station, and behind me is Caxton Hall, which in 1906 held a very important meeting of the WSPU, where Emily Davison was meeting with other members of the suffragette movement. And what they decided to do was they decided to march from here to Westminster in order to protest. And it really was the first time that they emerged on the national stage. And even though the word had been used before, the Daily Mail wrote about it and it popularised the word suffragette. And it came as it emerged from this building, Caxton Hall, where Emily Davison was at that meeting too. I'm now standing outside the Houses of Parliament here in the Palace of Westminster. Just there, the statue of Richard Lionheart, and there we have Westminster Abbey. But I've gone to this particular corner because just about in there, if you go way into the House of Parliament, which is hard to access at the moment, if you go in there, that's where St Mary Undercroft Church is. And we're here to talk about Emily Davison. On the night of the 2nd of April 1911, she came to the House of Parliament. She snuck in with essentially what would be a tour group or a group of people to petition their MP. And she broke away from the tour and she hid. She hid in a broom cupboard. Now that evening, the 2nd of April 1911, was a significant time because that's when the census was taken. The census is a key government document that counts all the people, and lots of various different things are used with that information. And you have to document where you are on a certain evening to count as the census. Now, so she was able to put on her census form that on the 2nd of April 1911, she was resident of the Houses of Parliament. Now, this meant several things. It meant that they had to pay council tax, so she has a good laugh on there. But it also meant that this became an official house, a residence, and she used it as a symbol to saying, well, I can't vote, I'm a suffragette, and you've not allowed me to vote in the House of Parliament, yet my residence is here, is the House of Parliament, and it caused quite a stir. In the 1980s, two MPs set up a plaque, which you can go, I think if you go on an organised tour of the House of Parliament, you can go and see. Those two MPs were Tony Benn and a man called Jeremy Corbyn, who's been in the news quite a lot recently. So Emily Davison, that was one of her first, most interesting protests, was to hide in a broom cupboard here in the Houses of Parliament. As Emily developed her time in the suffragettes, she grew a reputation of militancy, and one of her most famous acts was the blowing up or the setting on fire of post boxes. Now, unfortunately, the one that she blew up or she burnt to the ground is no longer around, but this one in Hampstead High Street from 1870 was actually burnt and destroyed by one of her colleagues in the suffragette. You can see the lovely spidery Victorian VR there to symbol Queen Victoria. What they used to do is put some phosphorus in a letter, put them in, it would obviously burn all the letters, it ignites, and then they would claim responsibility of it. And this is how Emily Davison grew her name as one of the most militant members of the suffragettes. Well, I've now ended up at a building site, which you can just see through that arch there on the Holloway Road, now called Parkhurst Road. This was the location of Holloway Prison, where Emily Davison, after all her militant activities, burning the post boxes and going to the House of Parliament, etc., she was taken here, and she was taken here several times. And indeed, when you see lots of pictures of her, she's actually got a brooch, which was called the Holloway brooch, which was given to any suffragettes who were sent here. Now, it was here that she was force-fed. She used to go on hunger strikes along with other suffragettes and was force-fed many, many, many times. And really did struggle through that with her determination. It was been torn down quite a long time ago. They built this various different development, and I think they're taking it down again. But across the road from it is actually one of the older parts of the building, which... Well, I've made my way up here to Epsom Racecourse, and on June the 4th, 1913, Emily Davison made her way down here on the train to Epsom, up the hill, presumably on coach or maybe possibly walked, here to the Epsom Derby, a huge racecourse. Now, at the time, there would have been hundreds of thousands of people crammed in all along here. The racecourse goes all the way around here. But she was standing over there at a place called Tottenham Corner, and we'll make our way there now. Well, I'm standing here now at Tottenham Corner at Epsom Racecourse. You can just about see the corner there as the horses would have come down racing on a normal, typical horse race. But on June the 4th of 1913, Emily Davison was standing about here, maybe closer to the number 3 just behind me there. She came here to make a protest. She had various different suffragette flags in her bag, and so what she decided to do was break the barrier, climb over the barrier, and run towards the King's horse, Anma, the King, who was at the race ground just around me here, where we've just been, who was there, was here to watch his horse, but he watched a suffragette, Emily Davison, run out to the course and try and grab the reins of that horse. Unfortunately, however, she suffered some injuries, horrific injuries. She was taken to hospital 4 days later on the 8th of June 1913. She died of her injuries, a fracture to the skull. She received some hate mail at hospital from various different people, and even the Queen called her a horrid woman for what she did or what she tried to do as a protest. But it was here on this spot that one of the most significant and tragic events of the suffragette movement took place. Now, Epsom Racecourse has got a very nice view of London, and you can see, I mean, it might be a bit too far away for you to make out, but you can see some of the sights that we've encountered on this walk, and it's a nice spot to summarise Emily Davison and the impact she had. Many historians do say that she's kind of framed through the method of her death, ultimately, and that's where her real fame comes from, which perhaps is unfair on her, because she did have a life before that, and she had a life of protest and pushing through of women's voting rights here in Britain, and then ultimately that led to it in the world. Because after her death, actually just before her death, she had been ostracised by the suffragette movement, by Pankhurst and others, who felt that she was being too militant and they didn't want to go down that approach, and she had sort of been left in the wilderness a little bit, and they took a more peaceful approach. And indeed, a year after her death, World War I, the suffragette movement was put on hold, and by the end of the First World War, women were given the vote. So some might argue that it was their push towards a more peaceful approach that led to the vote, and the militancy of Davison perhaps wasn't the right approach, but I think that's open for debate. Another thing that is perhaps interesting to discuss is her frame of mind at the time. Some people have suggested that this was a suicide that she committed here. She indeed was of a bit of, you can understandably would be of a weak frame of mind. As I said, she'd been ostracised from the suffragette movement. She'd been arrested many times. She'd been force-fed 49 times in prison, and was perhaps slightly fragile in her beliefs. And so she might have done this as an act like that. However, I'm not so sure. She had a return ticket to London in her pocket. She had a diary with various different events in her pocket. And she had a ticket for a concert that night. So I'm not totally sure that that is true and valid. And I think all of this can bring up a little debate which you might like to have with others about the difference between violent and non-violent protest. Emily Davison did destroy property. She did attack people. Her very death was slightly violent, albeit on herself. Is that a more effective way of protest than a more peaceful approach that other suffragettes would do? Perhaps that's a debate you can have yourself. Anyway, thanks very much for coming along and with me on this trip along the life of Emily Davison, and I hope you come and see it too, and I'll see you next time.